Hey everyone, welcome to this video where we continue talking about forms. This time we're going to talk about radio buttons and checkboxes, plus field sets and legends. These additional elements can really add a lot of functionality to our forms. Let's start with radio buttons. We use radio buttons when we want the user to select one and only one option. We create the radio button where we set the input type equal to radio. Let's add 3 radio buttons to our Week 10 demo forms as the continuation from our previous lecture. We're going to add those 3 radio buttons to help our user choose the type of crust that they're going to want for this pizza, and we're going to put them right before our text area element. I'll just use copy-paste to make them, and I'll throw in a couple of break elements. Now notice that the radio buttons immediately show up on the form, but we have no way of really identifying what those radio buttons are for, so we're going to need labels to help with that. Now before we added labels before an element or an input, let's add the labels directly after our radio button. And I said these were going to be for our crust types for the pizza, so we're going to use thin crust, hand-tossed, and deep dish. And now I have 3 radio buttons and I can select them, but we have a couple of things we're going to fix, because one, it's difficult sometimes to kind of tap that little circle or land in that little circle. So we're going to use the foreign ID attribute trick that we used previously to connect our labels and our inputs together. Remember, the foreign ID attribute need to have the same value in order for those to work. For example, if I were to change my thin crust label to have the attribute equal to thin, then I'm going to use the same ID of equal to thin on my input. Let's try that. So when I select the radio buttons, it works, and when I select the label, it works. I'll make sure to do that for hand-tossed and deep dish. And I'll scroll this up for a little more space. And once again, I'm going to always test everything I do to make sure it works, so let me select those labels. And notice hand-tossed doesn't work. I have an issue, but deep dish does. So looking real quick at our IDs and our for attributes, we have to figure out what's different for hand-tossed. Notice how my input ID for hand-tossed has a lowercase h but an uppercase T for hand-tossed, whereas the label's for attribute doesn't match. This means we have a case sensitivity issue, and we need to be really careful when we're typing that we're using exact values. Most often, I like to make sure I'm getting things right by using copy-paste, because it's a shortcut that's going to help speed up our process, and it's going to cut down on the number of keystroke errors that we're going to make when we're coding. So I will select it, copy it, and paste it. Then I'm going to test it out to make sure that fixed my issue. And sure enough, that worked. It's really important to not just assume that things that we do thinking we're fixing an issue is actually fixing the issue without testing it. Okay, before I go any further, we're going to go back over to our live server and give this a test, because I want to talk about something before we continue. If I select thin crust, hand-tossed, and deep dish, and I order my pizza, nothing passes to the server. So that's a clear indication that we don't have a variable to store our value into, meaning we're missing our name attribute to put our value into. So I'm going to do this wrong, and then I'm going to talk about why. Let's say we have our name attribute equal to the foreign ID attributes the same way we recommended previously. We're going to have them match. And then we're going to go back and test our form. I'll go ahead and select thin crust, hand-tossed, and deep dish and order my pizza, and look what happened. If I'm the end user or the person in the kitchen who is working on making this pizza, I have no idea what crust I'm supposed to use, because the end user was able to select all 3. With radio buttons, we don't want that. We want only one value to pass to the server. So we need to make sure that when we're doing this, the name attribute matches for all 3 of our radio buttons. And additionally, we don't want to pass over on. Because radio buttons are a Boolean, either they're selected or they're not. The default for the browser is just to assume on or off, meaning if we didn't select a value and submitted it, it just wouldn't be there. Noticed how thin and hand-tossed passed over, but deep dish didn't? That's because it just wasn't selected, so it's Boolean. Let's go back and fix our name attribute first. we're going to say, what crust type? And because I don't want to make any mistakes, I'll copy paste. So each of my radio buttons shares the same name. Then I'll go back and select my crust, and I can only pick one. Radio buttons are supposed to allow us to only have one selection being made. What happens is, as the end user we're filling out our form, we select the first item. The name is now equal to thin. We try to select the same one. Now this one overwrites the previous name's value from thin to hand tossed, and all the way over to deep dish again, overwriting what the name's stored value was from hand tossed to deep dish. So only one value can be stored in that name variable at a time to pass over to the server. So now when we order pizza, we have crust type, but look what happens because we didn't set a value. The Boolean tells us that one of them was selected, but we don't know which one. So radio buttons, we need to also make sure we have a value. The value can be anything we want it to be, but I will caution it's best to use a value that doesn't have a space and starts with a lowercase letter. If you're going to use more than one word, make sure you're using camel casing to pass over to the server. Let's say the input for the thin is going to be equal to the value of thin. Then we'll have hand tossed and deep dish. And one more time, let's test out our changes. I'll select thin crust. Nope, I want hand tossed. I want deep dish. Now when I hit order pizza, this is information that's very helpful. We know we're looking at our crust type, and we know which crust type was selected. This is the magic behind getting radio buttons to work, making sure we're assigning the same name attribute to each radio field, and then making sure we're using a very helpful and descriptive value attribute to carry over to the server. But we still have a lot more to cover, so let's quickly go back and do that. So because our radio buttons are a group of elements, it's really important to use an appropriate semantic marker or element to indicate that those belong together. We use a Fieldset element to group related elements on our form, and then we have a legend element that goes with it to provide a title for our grouped elements. Let's wrap the radio buttons inside of a Fieldset, and then notice that the browser is going to style it by default. That gray border comes from the browser, and the legend sits right inside the Fieldset at the top. And this is going to be like choosing your crust type, so we'll put in choose a pizza crust. We can style this down the road, but this is the default behavior from the browser. And we will work on styling forms in another video. But let's add a few more things because let's cover checkboxes. See, checkboxes are like radio buttons, but they allow the user to select more than one choice. So we need to have a different value for each of the name attributes, a little bit different than how we just did the radio buttons, but you'll get the idea as we go through this. So we created the radio buttons using an input where the type was equal to radio. Now we're going to do one for checkboxes where the input type is equal to checkbox. We're going to do this right after our radio button field set. And I'm just going to copy paste to give us 5 checkboxes. Let's add a few break elements. And just like with the radio buttons, we have checkboxes. They work, I can check them. And I can uncheck them. But it's not really helpful without our labels and our for and ID attributes and our values, all of those things that we had before for radio buttons. We need to have all of that again for the checkboxes. So first I'm going to add all of the labels, then I'm going to backfill that information with all of my attributes. And because I want to have in the future all of my checkboxes and all of my radio buttons start and look very consistent to each other, I'm going to make sure I put my label after my checkbox. These are going to be for our toppings, so I'll put in pepperoni, black olives, green peppers, onions, and pineapple. And I want to be able to click on the label, so I'm going to do my for and ID attributes immediately. And always, 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 we're going to test to make sure our changes took effect. I can select the label, and I can unselect. But just like before, I need a name to store a value, and I need to pass over a value. I don't want to just have checked or unchecked be the value that passes to the server, because just like a radio button, a checkbox is also a Boolean. Either it's checked or it's not. So I'll add my name and my value attribute. But every checkbox needs to have a different name attribute, and I'll show you why. Let's say I set all of my toppings to have the same name. And I'll go over and I will try this out. We're going to do a hand tossed with pepperoni and onion and pineapple, and then we'll order our pizza. But look what happens. Only one topping passes over to the server, even though we selected 3 separate toppings. That's because the name attribute can only store one value at a time, so it's only going to select the last one we picked. I select pepperoni, that becomes the name attribute's value. Then I select onions, that overwrites pepperoni. Then I select pineapple, that overwrites onions. So that's the only value that passes to the server. So the key with the checkboxes is each one needs to have a different attribute value. And remember, you don't want it to just have on. You want it to have a value. Let's fix that. And of course, we'll always test our code. Let's have pepperoni, olives, and onions. Now we have pepperoni, olives, and onions. And both the name and the value attributes are the same, and that's fine. Sometimes developers will use codes for the values. That's fine too. But just whatever we do, we want to be consistent and descriptive. Let's wrap our checkboxes inside of a field set and then add a legend, and we'll put it as toppings. You know, our pizza form is looking pretty good. Let's add a few more things. How about the checked attribute? So just like with the required attribute, when you use the checked attribute, you don't specify a value. Checked is either true or false. So let's say we put pepperoni as checked. We just write the attribute checked, and it always has pepperoni checked. Now on load of the form, every single time that value is checked, the end user can uncheck it and submit the form without the form being checked. So in that respect, it could be more like a suggestion for the end user. When you do checked though with a radio button, it doesn't have the same effect. Let's say we have thin crust as checked. I can't uncheck thin crust. The only thing I can do is transfer that value over to deep dish or hand tossed. So having the checked attribute on your radio buttons is kind of like enforcing a requirement that they select one of those values. Okay, I have one more to cover, and that'll be the end for this video, and that's going to be the drop-down or select menu. We create this using the select element, and then inside of our select element, we'll insert several different option elements. And those are going to be the menu choices that are for that particular select. So let's say underneath our pizza topping, we add a drop down for a payment type. Let me scroll up. And notice right away on the form, it automatically starts with that drop down. I don't have anything in there, but you can see it pops up on our form right away. Let's add a few options. We'll do cash, credit, or check. And this looks pretty neat, but it would be much better if we had a label. And we can't forget our foreign ID attributes, making sure we test it. Move that a little bit. And we need to have a name attribute to pass to the server. And let's test this out. I can select payment type. Notice that the cursor automatically highlights. I can select a drop down and let's pick credit. Order pizza. There's our payment type, passing over the value of credit. But we didn't specify what the value was going to be. That's because if no value attribute is used in the option element, then the content inside of the option element goes to the server. And while this works for this particular example, it's always better to use a value attribute because the option might contain special characters or spaces, and that could make processing on the server side a lot more difficult down the road. For example, what if one of my options is, can I wash dishes? Now I select my payment type of can I wash dishes and I select order pizza. That's what passes to the server, but this could be a real problem if in our processing we aren't able to escape or remove spaces, or if that question mark causes issues down the road. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to use a very specific value on our option. And this way we get to use lowercase letters. Let's test it out now. My payment type, can I wash the dishes? When I order my pizza, now my payment type goes over as a single word with a lowercase letter, and I'm not going to have to worry about stressing or taxing out the server in any code that we have running in the background. Okay, that was a lot of information on forms. So if you have any questions on this content, please don't hesitate to ask.